This video is not a review. If anything, it's penance. It's paying recompense for committing what is, to me, a cardinal sin of media criticism, judging a game more for what I wanted it to be than what the developers are actually intending. I like to think of this as the JonTron problem after the first video I watched and thought, you know what, that right there might be some bad faith criticism. The game in question is one I dug out from an itch.io charity bundle from a while back. Tenderfoot Tactics, an indie tactics RPG made by Icewater Games, riffing off isometric classics like Final Fantasy Tactics, but with a bunch of idiosyncratic ideas that make it unlike anything I've played before. The problem is that I went in with a bunch of structural expectations that the developers of Tenderfoot were not at all interested in satisfying. I went in with a specific itch to scratch, linear progression of combat encounters with a steady increase in complexity along with my unit's power curve. Instead, what I got was dropped into an open world, wandered around a bit, found an encounter full of enemies dropping AoEs that I was not at all prepared to deal with, and got thoroughly wrecked. Needless to say, I bounced off the game pretty quick. But that's not exactly fair, is it? If the store page makes it clear that this is a game about open-ended exploration more than anything else, my desire for linearity does not matter. Thing is, I've tried giving the game its due. I played it for several hours over a weekend and just never quite clicked with it, but I'm bothered. I'm bothered by my initial knee-jerk rejection and wanted to at least put down my thoughts about what Tenderfoot Tactics does interestingly. My experience with the game is limited, but the devs did have some ideas that I think are worth a look, especially since not everyone is going to have the same hangups as I do. If I can point a few more eyes at it, maybe someone that genuinely vibes with it will have a new favorite indie game, you know? So, let's get to it. Do I want my tactics game creamy or crunchy? Creamy. I gotta go with creamy. The basic skinny of Tenderfoot Tactics is that you're a bunch of adorable little goblins in a world being consumed by an ethereal spirit called the Fog. You and your band are sent out into the world by a friendly spirit, and that's about it, honestly. You're given a direction and there is an end goal, but you're mostly left alone. You've got a map, a boat to sail the archipelago, a bird you can use to scout for landmarks, and the world is your oyster. In theory, anyway. In practice, if you keep heading in a single direction, you're going to start running into encounters that you're just not at all ready for, hence my getting bodied earlier. You can try and slip past, but the better idea is to just hop in your boat, pick something in the distance, and go see what you can find while you start powering up your crew. Find some new biomes, find new classes, find a town with good gear, find a giant ribcage. And you have to an extent. The open world makes balance a little bit wiggly, and you're going to need to poke around a bit before you have units that are capable of doing the harder stuff, so the game just kind of becomes a lot of wandering. Wandering that I don't want to do. If I'm playing a tactics game, I'm here for the combat puzzle, and would rather do without fiddling around on a world map. And yet, the way the devs handled the world map is pretty neat. For one, it is a trippy visual treat with excellent use of color. Reminds me of Proteus from like a decade ago in some ways, but the actual genius is how you navigate it. When you're hoofing around on foot or scouting from up high, you can see points of interest as silhouettes or pillars of smoke, but your range of vision is relatively small. To actually plan long-distance travel, you need to look at a map, but the map you start with is incomplete. It's got a couple towers marked, sure, but no mark for you. Only way to get your position is by thinking relative. You have to pay attention to the land and the landmarks. Navigation gets even more complicated as you find more maps, because the towns in this setting are spread out and isolated because of the fog. Citizens only map the nearby area, and the maps will have different landmarks entirely. Some don't even agree on which direction is north. It's going to take some puzzling out. The devs put a lot of thought into how to make navigation a challenge on its own, and that is something that you don't see often, if at all. Indie games have toyed with similar ideas. I've seen mechanics to straight up triangulate your position using landmarks and stuff before, but in big AAA open worlds, this never happens. Even games like Breath of the Wild or Elden Ring, games with world maps designed from the beginning with clear sightlines and memorable landmarks, games that could be navigated in this way, still give you a detailed map, show your location, let you place waypoints, and generally try very hard to make sure the player is never lost. And that's fair. They're games made for a mass market, and the developers don't see navigation as the kind of challenge or fun they're necessarily aiming for. But when the map is so knowable, when you can plop a beacon and beeline past everything, it just makes the world feel smaller to me, and I would love to see Tenderfoot's ideas riffed on at that huge scale sometime. I think it would be pretty special. Side note, I started writing this before fully sinking into Elden Ring's Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, but playing that and seeing how FromSoft added a lot of verticality to the map and had areas kind of twist into and underneath each other like knots really dragged out the fun of navigating and made the map less reliable for finding some places. It was a lot of fun. It's not as extreme as Tenderfoot Tactics' multiple conflicting maps, obviously, but it makes me feel like they specifically could do something really nuts with this idea, you know? The other neat idea going on is in the combat side of things. At its most basic, this is a pretty typical tactics RPG. Your units can move and take an action each turn. There is a turn order you have to manage, hit the enemies until they're dead, and heal up your squad when you need to make sure they're not. Bing bang boom done. However, the game also tracks environmental stuff for each tile. Things like soil moisture, plant growth, heat levels, stuff like that. Too much water on a tile will stop you from acting if you're standing in it. Plant growth on tiles can slow your movement through them. Fire on tiles will hurt anything standing on it, stuff like that. But all of these aspects interact with one another. The most problematic example that you're going to run into all the time is fire. It spreads to adjacent tiles with plants. Units who are burning can actually spread it if they move. It's a real problem that you have to contend with. Mechanically, this isn't exactly unheard of. Larian Studios' Divinity Original Sin games had even more interacting terrain, attacks, and status effects that would combine into newer, worse problems for everyone around. And they did it in a much more maximalist for sickos way. The thing that's unique about Tenderfoot is when these interactions actually happen. Environmental effects like fire and status effects like poison don't proc on specific unit turns. It's actually separated out into what the game calls ticks, kind of like seconds essentially. Like each action on a unit's turn, like attacking or using a spell, takes about 24 ticks, and each individual tile a unit moves is 4 ticks. The more you move before an affected unit's turn in the turn order, the more damage fire or poison can deal before you or the enemy can do anything about it. This affects how you have to think about combat when damage over time is in play. It changed how I prioritized targets when fielding a poison archer, for instance. There were fights early on where the enemy shooting a single fire arrow absolutely wrecked me because I just overestimated how much damage it could do when I tried ducking out of a fire only to burn half my party anyway moving past them. I haven't played enough to comment on how balanced it is over the course of the entire game, or whether the systems start to lose their luster and just get in the way, but the idea itself is kind of brilliant, and I think anybody making turn-based games could learn something from it. Turn-based games can still benefit from a sense of tangible time, as long as you're going after the problem with just a little bit of inventiveness. So, those were the two things that stuck out to me as important, but they're not the only interesting quirks around. Multi-classing your units in this game limits you to only one skill from your non-equipped class, making you kind of pick and choose for specific tactical situations a bit more, or in my case, picking for character vibes. I had a little spell sword weirdo, still remembering how to just choke a motherfucker out from behind, and that was a lot of fun. In combat, flanking enemies or using certain abilities will actually push them further down the turn order, which adds some tactical depth and is a lot of fun to mess around with. The economy of the game is all reputation and bartering, so getting the best gear means finding a town and hanging around enough to actually kind of help them out, trade with them, get a little more fond of the place over time. There's good stuff going on here. This is a game that I can see myself liking under different circumstances. I don't know, maybe in a year or so if I have more time, or if I just start wanting something calmer and just need to vibe for a bit. As it is right now at the time of making this video, I couldn't justify spending more time on it, but I do love the developers' ideas and ambition. As someone noodling around with game ideas of my own from time to time, there's a lot to take from Tenderfoot Tactics, and for a small experimental indie game like this, interesting ideas is honestly all the value I need from them sometimes. If anything here sounds interesting to you, you can check out Tenderfoot Tactics yourself. It's on itch.io, link below in the description, as well as Steam for PC, and it's also on Xbox and Switch, if I remember correctly. You can also find more by the developers on their website, also linked in the description below. It's been a while since the last video, since I try not to make anything unless I actually have an idea or a game that I want to talk about or anything like that. It's just something I try to hold myself to so that I don't burn out making a video that I'm not interested in. But hopefully that was interesting enough game to pop in with. Until next time, fuck capitalism, go home, peace.